What if the diamond on your finger held within it the story of terror, betrayal, and colonial greed? This is not just a tale of beauty beneath the earth, this is the history of how Belgium, led by King Leopold II, turned the Congo into a nightmare disguised as civilization. This is the dark history of Congo's diamonds, and how Congolese diamond miners paid the ultimate price. To truly understand the dark history of diamond mining in the Congo, we must begin long before the first diamond was pulled from the earth. We must travel back to the 1880s, a time when Central Africa remained largely uncharted in the European imagination, a vast and resource-rich land yet untouched by formal colonization. But all of that was about to change. At the center of this transformation was one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. Born in 1835, Leopold ascended the Belgian throne in 1865. But unlike other European monarchs of his era, he wasn't content with his small nation. He hungered for an empire, not just for prestige, but for wealth. And Africa, in his eyes, was the answer. In 1884 to 1885, the infamous Berlin Conference was held. Organized by Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, this gathering of European powers essentially redrew the map of Africa, without a single African voice at the table. Their aim was to prevent conflict between European countries as they carved up the continent under the guise of civilizing Africa. Leopold, however, came to the table with a cunning plan. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a humanitarian. He claimed he wanted to bring Christianity, commerce, and civilization to the heart of Africa through a charitable organization called the International African Association. But this was a facade. Behind the scenes, Leopold had already dispatched explorers like Henry Morton Stanley, the same Stanley famous for uttering, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," to chart the Congo River and make treaties with local chiefs, often through deception or coercion. By the time the Berlin Conference concluded, Leopold had secured personal ownership, not just political influence, over more than 2.3 million square kilometers of Central Africa. It became known as the Congo Free State. But there was nothing free about it. This was not a Belgian colony. It was Leopold's private enterprise, his property. The Congo River was the lifeline of this vast territory. It provided transport deep into the interior, giving access to forests bursting with wild rubber and ivory. Leopold's regime quickly evolved into one of the most brutal exploitative systems in modern history. To enforce his will, Leopold created a private army known as the Force Publique, comprised largely of African soldiers led by Belgian officers. These troops were armed, indoctrinated, and unleashed upon the Congolese population to enforce rubber collection quotas that were deliberately set impossibly high. Entire villages were held hostage. Men were forced into the forests to gather rubber. Women and children were imprisoned, beaten, or mutilated if quotas were not met. Soldiers were required to account for every bullet fired by bringing back the severed hands of their victims, dead or alive. And so, hands became currency. A grotesque symbol of obedience. The mutilation of children and women was a common form of punishment or control. This reign of terror resulted in the death of an estimated 10 million Congolese, either through direct violence, starvation, disease, or despair. Families were shattered. Entire communities disappeared. Also, Leopold and his investors in Europe could profit from a booming rubber industry driven by the invention of the pneumatic tire. And all the while, the outside world knew very little of what was happening. The Congo was closed to outsiders. Missionaries, journalists, and foreign traders were watched closely. But slowly, word began to leak out. One of the most vocal critics was George Washington Williams, an African-American minister and historian who traveled to the Congo in 1890 and was horrified by what he saw. He published an open letter accusing Leopold of crimes against humanity, a term not widely used at the time. Then came Roger Casement, a British diplomat who investigated the atrocities in 1904 and published the Casement Report, which confirmed the shocking scale of the abuse. Activists like E.D. Morel and the Congo Reform Association began to rally global outrage. Under immense international pressure, and with mounting scandal at home, Leopold was finally forced to relinquish control of the Congo in 1908. The Belgian state formally annexed the territory, and the Congo Free State became the Belgian Congo. But make no mistake, While the brutal rubber regime ended, the underlying colonial machinery remained. Belgium merely exchanged one form of exploitation for another. The force public was retained. Racial segregation was institutionalized. And the vast mineral wealth of the Congo, soon to include diamonds, was now under direct Belgian control. What's essential to understand is that the system of forced labor, land expropriation, and racial domination pioneered by Leopold became the economic blueprint for Belgian rule. Even though diamonds were not the primary resource during Leopold's rule, his model of brutal extraction became the template for future Belgian-run mining operations in the 20th century. By the 1910s and 1920s, diamonds would be discovered in the Congo's Kasai region, and the same abusive structures, coerced labor, unequal wealth distribution, violence, would be used to mine them. So, when we examine the story of diamond mining in the Congo, it's not just a tale of minerals in the soil. It is a story rooted in blood, deception, and a long legacy of exploitation. A story that began with one man's greed for empire and left a nation, and a continent, scarred for generations. And this is only the beginning of our journey. What you are seeing here is not fiction. These photographs, many taken secretly by missionaries and journalists, reveal one of the most haunting truths of European colonialism: the deliberate mutilation and torture of Congolese men, women, and children under the rule of King Leopold II. From 1885 to 1908, the Congo Free State was not governed by the Belgian parliament, nor was it a colonial protectorate like many other African territories. It was a private corporate venture, ruled as the personal property of King Leopold II, under the deceptive name of humanitarian progress. To the outside world, Leopold portrayed himself as a philanthropic monarch, devoted to spreading Christianity and ending the Arab slave trade in Central Africa. But in reality, he had constructed a ruthless extraction economy focused on rubber and ivory, one that depended entirely on violent coercion, and in many cases, genocidal brutality. To maintain control and enforce labor, Leopold created the Force Publique, a colonial militia made up of African conscripts, often recruited through intimidation, led by European officers. They were equipped with rifles, leather whips known as chicots, and absolute authority to terrorize the population into submission. Rubber was the primary export. The process of harvesting it was arduous and painful. Villagers, particularly men, were forced to trek deep into the rainforest and tap wild rubber vines, a process that required them to coat their skin with sticky sap and peel it off their bodies later, often losing flesh in the process. But the cruelty extended far beyond hard labor. Each village was assigned a rubber quota. These quotas were frequently impossible to meet, especially during seasons of flooding or drought. When targets weren't achieved, punishments followed, brutal, public, and meticulously documented by Leopold's administrators. Entire families were held hostage. The common tactic was simple but effective: if the men did not return with enough rubber, their wives or children would be killed, raped, or mutilated. Villagers were whipped with chicots until they collapsed from blood loss or shock. In many cases, the punishment for not meeting a quota was amputation. Hands. Hands were everything. The Force Publique was required to account for every bullet they used, to prevent waste and unauthorized killings. For every bullet fired, soldiers were ordered to bring back a severed right hand as proof that it had been used correctly, that is, to kill a rebel or an unproductive native. But this system led to perverse practices. If soldiers missed their targets or hunted animals instead, they would simply cut off the hands of living villagers, often women, children, or the elderly, to meet the quota. One of the most famous and tragic photos from this period was taken by the missionary Alice Seeley Harris, a British Baptist who worked in the Congo and documented the atrocities. She photographed a man named Nsala of Walla, sitting before the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter. He had failed to collect enough rubber. The price? The life and limbs of his child. These images were not just shocking. They became evidence. Evidence that disproved Leopold's lies. He had long insisted that stories of cruelty were invented by rival nations or anti-colonial agitators. But the camera didn't lie. The work of missionaries like Harris, and diplomats like Roger Casement, made the international community confront a crime too vast to ignore. Public outrage eventually took shape through the Congo Reform Association, co-founded by E.D. Morel, a shipping clerk who noticed something peculiar. Ships returning from the Congo were always filled with rubber and ivory, yet they carried only guns and chains on the journey in. He exposed the economic hypocrisy and human cost of Leopold's operation. His alliance with Casement and other whistleblowers led to one of the earliest and most impactful human rights movements of the modern era. But still, for millions of Congolese, the damage was irreversible. Villages were depopulated. Oral histories tell of entire communities where no able-bodied men remained. Survivors lived with physical scars and far deeper psychological wounds. Some children, born during this time, would never know their parents. Others would grow up believing that mutilation was a natural consequence of disobedience. A generation was broken. Estimates vary, but most credible historians now agree that between 8 to 10 million people died during Leopold's rule, a number equivalent to half the population of the Congo at the time. These were not accidental deaths, they were the predictable outcome of a system built on fear, punishment, and total disregard for African lives. And what did Leopold gain from this human suffering? He became one of the wealthiest monarchs in Europe. His personal fortune swelled with the profits of rubber and ivory. With the money extracted from the Congo, he built opulent palaces, theaters, monuments, and museums in Belgium, many of which still stand today. Incredibly, many Belgians in the early 20th century still viewed Leopold as a visionary builder, a man who expanded Belgium's global presence. It was not until years after his death in 1909 that the full scale of his crimes was truly acknowledged. But even then, the apology never came. This legacy matters, not just for its historical significance, but for what came after. When Belgium officially annexed the Congo in 1908, it did little to dismantle the violent structures Leopold had created. The economy still revolved around extraction. The people still had no political rights. And by the 1910s and 1920s, the next mineral obsession would arise: diamonds. But the miners who entered the earth in search of those glittering stones did so with a haunting inheritance, an inheritance of mutilation, of mutilated families, of mutilated futures. This is not just a footnote in history. It is a chapter written in blood, severed hands, and silence. And as we explore Congo's diamond industry in the decades that follow, remember, the cost of these resources was never just material. It was human. As satellite imagery fades into the grainy, black and white stills of colonial expeditions, we transition from the scars of Leopold's reign to a new phase of imperial ambition, the scientific and industrial conquest of Congo's underground wealth. After international condemnation forced King Leopold II to relinquish his personal hold over the Congo in 1908, the Belgian state officially took over and rebranded the territory as the Belgian Congo. But while the administration changed hands, the goal remained the same: extract value, this time with a more structured, corporate face. And it is here, in the early decades of the 20th century, that a new kind of colonial figure enters the scene: the geologist. Geologists were the vanguard of imperial exploitation, armed not with rifles, but with notebooks, rock samples, and an uncanny ability to see profit in the earth itself. Backed by companies like Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, UMHK, and Fourminier, two of Belgium's most powerful mining corporations, these men scoured the interior of the Congo in search of copper, cobalt, tin, gold, and something even more precious: diamonds. Their journey took them far beyond the Congo River, deep into the Kasai region, a vast plateau of forest, savanna, and mineral-rich soil. Locals had long known that strange, sparkling stones sometimes appeared in the riverbeds after a storm or heavy rain. But now, under Belgian eyes, these stones would be reclassified, recorded, and exploited. In 1912, the first alluvial diamonds were officially discovered near the town of Thikapa, along the Kasai River. These diamonds were not buried deep in the bedrock like those in South Africa. Instead, they were scattered throughout the sediment, small, but incredibly abundant. The river systems had washed them down from ancient volcanic sources for millions of years, leaving behind an accessible trail of wealth. This discovery ignited a corporate gold rush, only this time, for white stones. The Belgian state, already invested in industrial colonialism, partnered with the Fourminier Company, short for Société Internationale Forestière et Minière du Congo. Founded in 1906 with backing from both Belgian and American investors, Forminier quickly gained a monopoly over the diamond fields of Kasai. Under the guise of modern mining, Forminier introduced the systematic exploitation of diamonds using local labor. But this system was far from modern for the Congolese people. It was, in many ways, a continuation of Leopold's extractive regime, just wrapped in legal contracts and scientific language. Villages were relocated, and lands were reclassified as concessions. Congolese men were recruited as laborers, often through coercion or debt. Their pay was minimal. Their living conditions were poor. Their tools rudimentary, buckets, sieves, and bare hands. The process was painstaking. Workers spent hours in rivers, sifting through wet gravel and mud to find small, brilliant stones. Supervisors, always white, oversaw the collection, weighed the fines, and punished workers suspected of theft. Anyone caught hiding a diamond faced brutal consequences, imprisonment, whipping, or worse. Forminier set strict daily quotas. A man might spend the entire day hunched over in cold, dirty water, only to be told his collection was insufficient. These quotas, though less visibly violent than Leopold's rubber targets, still created desperation, tension, and resentment. And while diamonds flowed out of Kasai by the ton, the wealth did not remain in the Congo. By the 1920s, Antwerp, Belgium's port city, had become one of the world's major diamond centers, largely due to Congolese stones. Meanwhile, roads and railways in Congo were built not to connect communities or facilitate local trade, but to move raw materials from mines to European markets as efficiently as possible. The men who mined the diamonds wore tattered clothes and had no access to healthcare, education, or political power. The men who sold the diamonds wore silk suits and earned fortunes. And behind this disparity were the scientists, engineers, and investors who turned Congo's mineral wealth into Belgium's industrial might. One such figure was Jean Jadet, a Belgian banker and executive who played a central role in the Congo's mining and railroad expansion. As director of the Société Générale de Belgique, Jadet oversaw vast investments into Congolese mining operations. He helped finance not only the infrastructure that supported diamond extraction but also the railways that funneled minerals out of the interior. Then there was Emile Franqui, a soldier-turned-banker who once collaborated with Leopold II during the Congo Free State period and later helped shape Belgian colonial economic policy. He was a key player in ensuring that Congo's mineral wealth remained under tight European control. For shareholders, the dividends were dazzling. Forminier's balance sheet showed consistent gains. The company's revenues surged in the 1930s, as demand for industrial diamonds increased globally, especially with the rise of manufacturing and war industries. But for Congolese laborers, the diamonds remained a curse, a resource that brought wealth to outsiders and hardship to those who lived above it. This system continued, largely unchallenged, through the 1940s and 1950s. The diamonds never stopped coming. Neither did the profits. By the time the Congo neared independence in 1960, Forminier had exported tens of millions of carats, diamonds that helped build Belgium's post-war prosperity. And yet, the miners were still poor. Their communities still lacked schools, hospitals, roads, and political representation. Their labor fueled the engines of empire, but their lives remained untouched by its promises. These early 20th century explorations did more than map the land. They reshaped it, transforming rivers into tools of industry, villages into labor pools, and entire regions into zones of silent suffering. So while we remember the hands lost under Leopold's rule, we must also remember the backs bent, lungs filled with dust, and futures denied in the name of science and industry. The geologists may not have carried whips, but they carried maps that would redraw a nation's destiny. This was not just discovery. It was dispossession, written in geological surveys and mining claims. And as we follow the rise of Congo's diamond industry, we must ask, who truly benefited from what was found beneath the soil? This is not a scene from a forgotten battlefield, it is a snapshot of daily life in the diamond fields of colonial Congo. Under the punishing sun, barefoot Congolese men dig deep into the earth with rusted shovels, crude picks, and their bare hands. Above them, in crisp khaki uniforms, stand Belgian overseers, rifles slung over shoulders, whips coiled like vipers at their sides. This scene captures the reality of Congo's diamond mining industry during much of the 20th century, a reality built not just on geology, but on brutality, racism, and economic domination. Following the discovery of diamonds in the Kasai region in 1912, Belgium rapidly expanded its mining operations. The primary company responsible for diamond extraction was Formineer, a powerful Belgian-American enterprise with exclusive rights to mine diamonds in the region. By the 1920s and 1930s, Formineer had become a key pillar of Belgium's colonial economy, making diamonds second only to copper in the Congo's mineral exports. But behind every carat exported to Antwerp was the sweat and suffering of an invisible labor force, tens of thousands of Congolese men and boys, many of whom were recruited through coercion, taxation, or outright force. Recruitment into the mines was rarely voluntary. In villages throughout Kasai and beyond, colonial administrators implemented taxes that could only be paid in cash, forcing men to seek work on plantations or in mines to earn Belgian francs. Chiefs who refused to supply laborers faced fines, imprisonment, or the threat of violence from the force publique, the same paramilitary force created during King Leopold II's reign. Once inside the mining camps, life became a cycle of toil, surveillance, and punishment. Miners were often assigned quotas for how much gravel they had to dig and wash per day. Gravel was processed in hand-built sluices or sieves made of wood and wire, where workers strained the soil for diamonds, tiny stones that were easy to miss but carried enormous value. The stakes were high. If a worker failed to meet his quota, he might be denied food, beaten, or dismissed without pay. But if he found a diamond and kept it, the punishment was far worse. Diamond theft was treated as treason. Workers were frequently searched, sometimes strip-searched, and accused of smuggling. Suspected thieves were tortured, locked in overcrowded jails, or handed over to private security forces for beatings. Whipping was common. Some were killed as a warning to others. Even outside the mines, surveillance continued. Villages near mining areas were under strict control. Travel was restricted. Marketplaces were monitored. Communication was suppressed. The Belgian overseers had total authority. They dictated work hours, rations, punishments, and living arrangements. There was no appeal, no workers' union, and no legal protection. The racial hierarchy was embedded in every level of the system. European staff lived in spacious bungalows with running water, imported wine, and European newspapers. They had clubs, tennis courts, and private schools for their children. Meanwhile, Congolese workers were housed in crowded, poorly ventilated dormitories. Food rations consisted mainly of maize meal or cassava, with little protein. Sanitation was almost non-existent, and diseases like malaria, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread easily. Medical care, if provided at all, was minimal and often delayed. Families were often separated. Male workers were sent to distant camps for months or even years. Women were left behind to manage the household alone or, in some cases, forced to work in domestic roles for Belgian families or mission stations. Children, too, were affected. Boys were sometimes drafted as laborers or messengers. Girls were pulled from their families to serve as cooks or house girls. Education was scarce and usually limited to religious instruction or basic literacy, just enough to follow orders, not to question them. The Catholic Church, a powerful institution in the Belgian Congo, often worked in tandem with colonial authorities. Mission schools promoted obedience, not empowerment. The church baptized miners, married them under Catholic rites, and sometimes ran hospitals, but rarely challenged the injustice of the labor system itself. And all the while, the diamonds kept flowing. By the 1930s, Formineer was exporting millions of carats annually. These included both gem-quality diamonds and industrial diamonds, which were in high demand globally for use in tools, engines, and wartime machinery. Formineer's success enriched not only Belgian shareholders but also Belgium's national economy. The company's profits helped fund development projects in Brussels, modern infrastructure in Antwerp, and even royal monuments commemorating Belgium's colonial exploits. But almost none of this wealth was reinvested into Congo. The miners, those whose sweat made this fortune possible, remained in poverty. Belgian policymakers justified this system by claiming that Congolese workers were unskilled or uncivilized, incapable of managing their own resources. This racist logic allowed the continued exploitation of Congolese labor under the veneer of modernization and development. In fact, Congolese workers were incredibly skilled. They developed sophisticated techniques for washing gravel, identifying mineral density, and maintaining mining structures. They understood the land, the rivers, and the seasons far better than any European engineer. But their knowledge was neither acknowledged nor rewarded. It is important to remember that behind each diamond mine during this era was not just a glittering commodity, but a story of exploitation, of strength, of survival. The tools may have been crude, but the labor was precise, disciplined, and grueling. And it wasn't just about physical work. It was about enduring humiliation, danger, and isolation, day after day, year after year, for wages that barely bought a sack of rice. This diamond, though small, represents an entire history of colonial power and personal pain. For every one exported to Europe, there were thousands of man-hours behind it, extracted from bodies that were never truly free. This system did not end overnight. It continued through the 1950s and into the 1960s, until Congo's independence brought a new chapter, one still fraught with exploitation, but now entangled with geopolitics, Cold War conflicts, and local corruption. But before independence, before modern wars and corporate restructuring, there were the miners. The men in the pits. The women in the villages. The children who watched and learned and waited. The 1990s marked a new and devastating chapter in Congo's diamond story. What began as colonial exploitation evolved into something more chaotic, and just as deadly. Following the collapse of Mobutu Sese Seko's regime in 1997, the Democratic Republic of Congo descended into two consecutive wars, the First and Second Congo Wars, sometimes called Africa's World War. Over 5 million people died from violence, disease, and starvation. But behind the headlines of ethnic conflict and foreign invasion lay a powerful motivator: natural resources. Diamonds, alongside coltan, gold, and tin, became fuel for conflict. Armed militias, some backed by foreign governments, others operating independently, took over mining zones, especially in the rich provinces of Kasai and Oriental. Satellite imagery from this period reveals sprawling illegal mining camps tucked into forested zones, completely outside government control. These operations used Congolese civilians, often under threat or coercion, to extract diamonds that would be smuggled across borders to Uganda, Rwanda, and Angola, then sold into the global market. These were the so-called conflict diamonds, stones that financed warlords and prolonged suffering. Despite global efforts like the Kimberley Process, which aimed to curb the trade of blood diamonds, enforcement was weak, and corruption was rampant. The Congo's diamonds were no longer just a colonial relic. They had become currency in a new age of chaos, where the cost was still paid in human lives. Each hand tells a story. The calloused fingers of miners, scarred by years of labor, carry the weight of a nation's untold history. These hands have sifted through riverbeds and gravel, searching for stones that would never benefit them. Diamonds, symbols of wealth and status elsewhere, have often meant suffering here. As we watch diamonds being weighed, measured, and prepared for export, we must remember the legacy behind them. The ghost of King Leopold II, who initiated this exploitative system, still looms over Congo's past. His vision was not of development, but domination. Then came voices like Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected prime minister, who dared to speak of justice, dignity, and a future where Congo's resources served its people, not foreign powers. For that vision, he was silenced. Today, a new generation rises. Modern Congolese activists, journalists, and community leaders are reclaiming the narrative, demanding transparency in mining, ethical practices, and control over their land. This montage is not just a look back, it is a reminder that the hands that built this history still shape its future. The story of Congo's diamonds is still being written, and this time, more eyes are watching.
Subscribe for more videos like this.